Hey everybody, it's me, your buddy Dave, the host of the Dark Stuff channel here on YouTube. Thanks a lot for checking out my latest video. This week, I'm going to do another time travel episode. We're going to go back to the glorious days of the 80s. In this case, November 27th, 1987. And when I saw Kiss on the Crazy Nights tour and met Gene Simmons at the Red Lion Hotel. Yeah, that's right. We're talking about November 27th, 1987, when I saw Kiss on the Crazy Nights tour. This is the Crazy Nights album. Their 1987 album came out, I think, September 18th, 1987. The band's 14th album, produced by Ron Nevison. Now, at the time, I loved this album. Okay, loved it. And in fact, this was the first Kiss album that I bought on CD on like day of release. Remember, CDs were still relatively new in 1987. So this was the first one, and I was just amped as fuck. I like, oh my God, I got the new Kiss CD. You know, CDs are so much better than everything. Okay, whatever. We remember how we used to think back in the day. Crazy Nights was an important record for Kiss because they had taken the entire year off to wait for that producer, Ron Nevison. He had a big record with Heart, on their comeback album in like 85 or so. He did Ozzy, The Ultimate Sin in 86. That was a huge record. And so he's kind of had this reputation of taking artists from the 70s and bringing them into the 80s. Now, this is already 1987, so a little late for looking into that. But regardless, they put a lot into this record. It was also important because in that time that they were gone, Ace Frehley came back with his first post-Kiss album, and actually, it was the first time he ever even showed his face without makeup. Yeah, that promo poster and the ads that ran in magazines, that was Ace's first exposure, the first time he ever showed his face. Ace's first post-Kiss album, Frehley's Comet, had come out in April of 1987, and it set a pretty high bar because people did really, really like that album, and it did really well. So Kiss not only was following up one of their own big records, they were dealing with the hair metal era where there were so many bands. You know, Motley Crue had Girls, 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 and Whitesnake had a big record, Great White, Def Leppard, Aerosmith had a record that year. I mean, everybody had a record out that year, and they were competing against all of that stuff. Now, the album did do pretty well overall. It did go platinum. The tour itself didn't do that well, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Just to get us in the proper frame of mind, let's look at a couple of news events that were going on in November 1987. So number one, on November 3rd, Oakland A's first baseman Mark McGwire won the American League Rookie of the Year with 49 home runs, 118 RBIs, and he won the award unanimously. On November 4th, the NBA announced they're going to add 4 new franchises. It was their big expansion year. They were going to add Charlotte and Miami in 1988. And then they were going to add Minneapolis, or the Minnesota, and Orlando for 1989. Big deal if you like basketball and you don't live in New York. On November 5th, Ronald Reagan's Supreme Court nominee, Douglas H. Ginsburg, had to be pulled. He admitted using marijuana, which that big no-no at that time, and he ultimately withdrew, but you know, it was like Reagan's people asked him to step aside. A week later, they came out with Judge Anthony Kennedy, and he was nominated to the Supreme Court, and he stayed on the court until the Trump era and kind of left under a cloud of suspicion. On November 13th, Sonny and Cher played together for the very last time. They did I Got You Babe live on the David Letterman show, and that was the first time they'd played together since the 70s, and it was the last time they would ever sing together again. In the week of November 21st, 1987, the #1 song was Mony Mony by Billy Idol. Number 2, I've Had the Time of My Life by Bill Medley and Jennifer Warnes. Number 3, Heaven is a Place on Earth by Belinda Carlisle. Number 4, I Think We're Alone Now from Tiffany. And number 5, Brilliant Disguise by Bruce Springsteen. November 1987 was a crowded fall/winter for the Omaha market. I mean, there were so many events that were happening at that time. In that 30-day period, right? Yes performed on November 14th. Whitesnake and Great White the next night on November 15th. We had Hulkamania at the arena on November the 18th. Then, of course, we had Kiss and White Lion on the 27th. That's the show we're talking about. 2 days later, the Cars were at the arena. A week or so later, Def Leppard and Tesla. And then a few days after that was Aerosmith and Dokken. So it was a very, very crowded time. And if you look at the Billboard 200 charts from right around that time, you'll see Kiss was doing pretty well with Crazy Nights. It was at number 19. But you might also note higher than that was Yes at number 15, Aerosmith at number 13, Def Leppard at number 6, and Whitesnake at number 4. So all those bands were technically a lot more popular than Kiss was at that moment. Add that factor in and add the weather at the same time. Now, I didn't really remember this, but a friend of mine pointed out that we were having a snowstorm on the day of the Kiss concert. So I went to a website called extremeweatherwatch.com, and I looked it up, and November 27th, we had 3 inches of snow. And then November 28th, we had nearly 6 inches of snow. So in that period, 9 inches of snow. And that's a lot for Nebraska, even back then, before climate change, when we used to get a shit ton of snow. This was still a lot, and I'm sure that turned off a lot of people from going to the concert because they just didn't want to get stuck in the snow or get in an accident or something like that.
The heat of the Red Hot Kiss. Rose Productions presents a complete Kiss spectacle. If it's too loud, you're too old. Kiss Live. Special guest, White Lion. Good tickets for tonight still remain.
I mean, let me tell you something. No amount of snow is going to prevent me from going to this Kiss concert. I was at the height of my fandom. I was crazed. You know, I did a video a little while ago where I talked about the first time I met Gene Simmons. It was in January of '86 on the Asylum tour. I met the whole band of Kiss. A couple months later, I met them again, still on the Asylum tour in Des Moines. Well, now this was a full year and a half, almost 2 years later, on the Crazy Nights tour. But one of the things that I used to do was, you know, everybody knew that the bands that played at the arena stayed at this hotel called the Red Lion Hotel. It was in downtown Omaha. It was a 2-minute drive from the arena, so it was very convenient for bands. Now, the Red Lion Inn had been a Hilton hotel from when it was built in the 50s up until about 1980. Was taken over by Red Lion in 1980, and at the time, it was Omaha's premier hotel. It was like the nicest hotel in the city. The building still exists. It's now a DoubleTree. It's not the nicest hotel. I mean, I haven't been inside in decades, but it wouldn't be considered the nicest hotel in Omaha anymore, but it would be a decent hotel if you're looking for a downtown hotel. But whatever. I'm not in the hotel business, so what the hell do I know? So I had some previous experience meeting rock stars at the Red Lion Inn. For example, in 1986, my friends and I met John Bon Jovi there, and we saw him eating in the dining room of the hotel, and so we immediately just ran over to him. And his manager, tour manager, whoever was like, "Hey, he's eating. He'll come and talk to you when he's done." So we went over and got a table and sat there. And to be honest, I wasn't really all that confident that he was going to actually come over to our table because we figured his manager would just rush him out and that would be that. But whatever, we got a table anyways. And he actually did come over and talk to us for a couple minutes, sign some stuff and whatever, and actually was a very, very nice guy. So, you know, establishing that good guy image very early back in 1986. Bon Jovi was the opening act for 38 Special that day, by the way. Earlier that summer, in June of '87, my friend and I went to the Red Lion to see if we could talk to Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. So my friend who I went to the show with was actually cousins with the late Howie Epstein, who was the bass player for Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. But this was the days before cell phones, and so he had to call his uncle in Wisconsin, and then they had to try and track down Howie, and you know, we didn't really know whether we were going to hook up, but we were trying to find some Heartbreakers to see if they could tell Howie that his cousin was here. Long story short, we never hooked up with the Heartbreakers. One of the opening acts was the Del Fuegos, and we did bump into them. We saw them in the gift shop of the hotel, and they were fucked up. This was middle of the afternoon, and they told me that they were, I don't know why they were revealing this information to me, but they felt okay doing it, that they took tons of acid, and they went on the radio in the morning and interviewed on Z92, and they were just tripping balls and whatever, and they were super fun. We did see a couple of Heartbreakers walking around, though, And I unfortunately confused Mike Campbell and Stan Lynch, and I called Mike Campbell Stan, and I think that didn't set us up for becoming friends. Okay, so back to November 27th. So it was snowing. For some reason, my friend who I went to the show with later on that night didn't go with me down to Red Lion, but I decided on my own. I was 16, I had a car, and I drove all the way from West Omaha, suburbia, to downtown Omaha, to the Red Lion, parked, and decided I'm going to walk around and see if maybe Kiss is there. I had no idea. So normally there's no barrier to accessing the hotel. You can just walk right in. But in this particular case, there were some kind of rocker dudes standing outside, some headbangers, and the doors were closed and they had a guard in front of the door. And these other kids were not being let in. They looked more like rockers or whatever. I looked pretty normal, actually. I had, regular haircut. I didn't look like a Hessian or whatever. And I had a button-up shirt and everything. And so I walked up to the door and they said, "Are you a guest of the hotel?" And I'm like, yeah, totally. And then they said, "What floor are you staying on?" And I was like, well, I guessed a floor. And they said, "Okay, come on in." And I walked in and I was like, okay, well, that shows you, I look like a normal kind of guy with a button-up shirt. I had my Kiss shirt underneath it, by the way, but they didn't know that. I start walking around like I'm supposed to be there or whatever. And I remember going in the front door and then going to the left. And that was where the cafe is, or the restaurant. And of course, there's Gene Simmons sitting there eating lunch. And I'm like, what the fuck? I mean, I've been here 2 minutes, and there's a Gene sighting, and nobody else is around. The restaurant is like 2% full. There's nobody in there. He's eating lunch by himself. So I immediately walk over and to try to talk to him, and somebody kind of gets in my way and runs interference, a waitress, and is like, "No, come on, leave him alone." And then Gene waved her off and said, "No, come on over." So I go up to him and I introduced myself, and I told him that we had met, in 1980, the previous year, and that I did this fanzine called Kiss Rocks the World. And he says he remembers me, but whatever. So we start chatting, and he invites me to sit down at his table with him. I was nervous as fuck. I mean, this was the third time I'd met Gene Simmons, but that doesn't mean I wasn't still super nervous. And I wasn't good at just making idle chit chat, so I'm sort of sitting there being like, okay, what do I do? He's eating lunch. I'm here. I'm sitting next to Gene. I have his total attention. So then I say, "Hey, could I do an interview with you for the fanzine?" And he's like, "Yeah, okay." Well, that sounded pretty cool, except for the fact that I didn't have a recording device. I didn't have anywhere to take notes. Nothing, okay? So I just memorized what he tried to say, what he was saying, or tried to as best I could. And we did a real brief interview, and I don't remember too much about what he said other than I had asked him why Crazy Nights wasn't recorded digitally, because that was like new at the time. And on your CDs you would have, it was DDD if it was digitally recorded, digitally mixed, digitally mastered. It was AAD if it was analog, and analog digital, whatever. So he tried to explain to me how it didn't make any difference, and when you put it on vinyl, anyways, it went over my head kind of, but he basically said that was nothing. I asked him if he'd heard the Vinnie Vincent record that had come out the year before. He said he had, and he said he didn't understand why anyone was stupid enough to allow Vinnie Vincent to produce an album. That's what the gist of the interview right there. Okay, then I had the waitress take a picture of the two of us, and a friend of mine, whenever I post this photo, makes the joke that it looks like he's trying to squeeze the wallet right out of my pocket with the bear hug that he's given me in the picture. But whatever, I was on cloud nine. I just got to hang out with Gene Simmons. Now, he left and went up in the elevator to his room or whatever. I hung out for a little while longer to see if I was going to meet anybody else, if Paul was going to be there, Eric or Bruce Kulick, and I didn't see any of them, so I went home. Later on, drove out to the show at the Civic Auditorium, and the opening act on that show was White Lion. And I concede to kind of liking White Lion at the time. They had that album Pride and, When the Children Cry and Wait, and those are their hits at the time. But I kind of remember Mike Tramp of White Lion being very critical of Kiss at the time and sort of mocking them and saying that, like, oh, these guys are dead, they're over. The only people that are here every night are people here to see White Lion. Now, I didn't feel like traipsing the entirety of the internet reading Mike Tramp interviews to try to pull the exact quote, but I did find a quote from a different interview where he just talked about we were on the worst Kiss tour that ever happened. And they said it didn't really affect them. Now, that's a nicer way of saying what he said in that other interview. But I will tell you, I have held a grudge against White Lion ever since that time. And many, many years later, we're probably talking 2010 or something like that, White Lion was playing in this little basement club here in Omaha called the Sokol Underground. Holds about 400 people. And I went there and I was like, whoa, Mike Tramp, look at you. You're playing in a basement on a Tuesday in front of about 75 people, and Kiss is still playing at arenas and stadiums. So I guess people weren't just there to see you. Now, like I said, there were other shows in the immediate area, and a lot of people had to make decisions. I can afford this one, I can't afford that one. And apparently a lot of people decided that they were going to go to Whitesnake and Aerosmith and Def Leppard and not go to Kiss that year, because the attendance at that show was 2,592 in an arena that holds 9,000. That makes it about 28-29% full. Now, I wasn't thinking in those terms back then, okay, because I was 16 and I was just excited to be at a Kiss concert, but I did notice that, like, there were just a few rows of people standing on the floor, and then it was just empty. Beyond that, you could get up close. So if you just looked in the front, and all my photos are from where I was sitting at the show, it doesn't look that bad. But, you know, for them staring out over the crowd and seeing 2,000 people in an arena that holds 9, you know, it couldn't have been like a really good feeling for them that particular night. I mean, and I remember, you know, loving the show. Okay, so the attendance wasn't like an issue for me or anything. It wasn't like, oh man, Kiss is really losing it, I should go home. So of course I picked up a Kiss t-shirt. Now I can't fit in this one. This is from 1987. Come on. Okay, but I do still have it with his, you know, they were really into being dirty at this time, and everything was sexual and everything. And so this was, life is like sex. The more you put in, the more you get out. That was Paul Stanley's quote that year. So after the show, I found out that a friend of mine, an older friend of mine who I used to trade Kiss tapes with, who was working as a limo driver at the time, drove Gene and Paul from the arena back to the Red Lion Inn, their hotel. And it was, of course, that's a 2-minute drive, but in it, he did say that he heard Gene and Paul bitching to their tour manager, complaining about how nobody was there and how embarrassing it was and how angry they were, and they were yelling at the guy. Now, I don't know what he could have done. He didn't book Def Leppard a week later. I mean, that wasn't his fault, but regardless. So, like I said, looking back on this album now, it's really not one of my favorites from Kiss, and none of the songs are really all that memorable. I mean, Crazy Crazy Nights was okay. If Life is a Radio, turn it up to 10. I don't know. The lyrics were a little cheesy. I didn't like Reason to Live. That was the ballad, the big ballad at the time. I think it was an international hit. Didn't do much in the States. Again, the album did go platinum and was pretty successful, but it just, touring for them, that tour was not good numbers for Kiss. I mean, I remember feeling bad for them, and I was just a 16-year-old kid. You know, despite Gene's reputation for being kind of a dick, the 4 times I met him in the late 80s, he was always very, very nice to me. I have a feeling he was nicer to fans than he was to maybe industry people or critics or interviewers or whatever. But regardless, I was a kid back then, and he was always very nice to me. And this was the 3rd of my 4 experiences meeting Gene and Kiss. Well, thanks a lot for watching, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
So, you have a MySpace page or something?